Hi guys, well, for a first video, I suppose I wanted to hit a topic that I kind of realized was the historical anniversary as of today and kind of heading into tomorrow. I know this is more in the world history category, and I'm not sure a whole lot of people either know about this or really care much, but I figure it need to be addressed or mentioned. And that is about the 1905 Russian Revolution that took place in the Russian Empire. Now, this was about 100. This would be 115 years ago that this revolution really broke out, and this was not the revolution that really brought in the communist Bolsheviks that eventually kind of formed the Soviet Union and abolished the Russian monarchy. This was a separate revolution that kind of took place beforehand that did not see the overthrow of the Russian monarchy, did not see the overthrow of the Russian autocracy, but it did see it kind of become weakened or fractured. And it did see kind of the harboring of resentment toward the current Russian regime that would lead to the 1917 revolution that would ultimately succeed. I guess how to start this thing out would be the list of causes, I suppose. And there were quite a few causes that caused this revolution to break out with the people of Russia. And I suppose the first part would be the factor at the time Russia was losing the Russo-Japanese War with Japan over in Asia. Now, they had kind of come into Japan and Russia had conflicting interests in the Manchuria, China area, and both of them wanted great influence in this area, and ultimately Japan attacked first with a naval fleet and naval battle at the Battle of Tsushima Strait, and ultimately destroyed the entire Russian naval fleet in the Far East, and it really upset the Tsar's forces there, and they just took battle after battle to the Russian forces there, and the Russians were repeatedly getting beat. And this created great problems at home because in order to fund this war, the Tsar and his government were constantly kind of raising the taxes. But when they rose these taxes, they were only raising them on the lower classes, the working labor classes and the peasants. They were not raising it on the higher wealthy peoples. And this really caused much resentment in the empire. As for another cause would be the fact of labor. And Russia was not like a bunch of the other European nations and world nations at this time. It was still kind of backward a little bit. The Russian people widespread kind of wanted to adapt and change with the times because they're entering the early 20th century. Industrialization had by then long been taking place, and other countries were modernizing. Well, Russia, due to the Romanovs with Tsar Nicholas II still in power, they were not exactly all that willing to modernize with the rest of the world. And they kind of didn't allow Russia to develop as other nations, Western nations had really. And this kind of created a problem. Russia still had immense problems in its labor with the factor many of them did not hardly get a break during the week. They had to work almost every day of the week. Many Russian workers basically will work to the point of exhaustion. They didn't really have no free time at all. Many of them were paid like the bare minimum that was possible, so much that they could barely sustain their families in most cases. And there was even widespread child labor still in this country at that time, which in the rest of the world by then was kind of either mostly abolished or being done in the process of being abolished. And this kind of created a major problem with labor in Russia, and the factor the labor class was the lower middle classes. It was not the higher working class, and these middle classes started to highly resent the regime for not changing these laws, for not adapting, or at least making the higher classes take their share of this burden. Another thing that was kind of ticking, or at least a ticking bomb at least, was the nationality problem in the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire stretched from basically from what is now Poland all the way to the Far East on the Sea of Japan and all of that, in Asia. It included other countries that weren't exactly Russia, and it had multi-ethnic peoples. It was not just Russian. You had I mean, the Russians were Slavic, along with a bunch of the other peoples, but you had, like, the Baltic states were under their control, Finland was, you had the Poles and Russian Poland, I suppose, it wasn't occupied. You had other minorities down in the Caucasus region, near the Georgia and what is now Georgia and Armenia, and then you had, like, Kazakhstan's and Uzbekistan and all that. They had ethnic minorities that were not Russian at all. And the Russian Empire really had a problem with its ethnicities because of one factor, and that was if you were not Russian, you were kind of treated almost as a downward middle class. Russian peoples would receive the most privilege, it seemed, and if you weren't, you were almost just kind of tossed off, not really given the same rights. Like Christianity was promoted over any other religion in the Russian Empire due to that most Russians were Eastern Orthodox Christians. So even though they had Islamic peoples and other religions like Jews especially, for some reason the Russian Empire did have a anti-Semitism vibe to it. They were not exactly the most kind to Jews. Now, not to the same degree that Nazi Germany later would be, but to a degree they were kind of negative toward them. But these were some of the factors that kind of were starting to play in the Russian people's minds, and eventually the people got so tired of this that they kind of started drawing a list of demands. And this was headed by a Orthodox priest named Georgy Gabrun, and it was on February 22nd, 1905, on a Sunday. He and about anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 protesters went to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia at the time, and the Tsar's home. Now, the Tsar was not actually home at this time. He was actually somewhere else in the nation, but he had left the police and the authorities in charge in St. Petersburg. And these protesters marched to the Winter Palace. They wanted to address the Tsar to maybe cause a few changes. They wanted some labor reform, and they wanted like an increase in their wages. They wanted a shorter work week, and they also wanted basically a democratically elected People's Legislative Assembly, which Russia did not have at all at the time. Well, the Tsar, before leaving St. Petersburg the day or two before, had instructed his guards and police that to not let the protesters pass a certain point on the palace grounds. And these people were not violent in any way. They had no guns, no weapons, no nothing. They actually came in and they were singing the Russian national anthem, which was Hail to the Tsar, and singing his praises and everything. They were trying to appeal to his sentiment. Well, they passed one of the main gates of the palace, and the guards, unfortunately, opened fire and killed roughly anywhere between, it's estimated, about 400 to up to 800 of the protesters were shot down, and this event later became known as Bloody Sunday. Now, this kind of really set off the Russian people even more, because now not only did they not only receive confirmation that they were going to have to do a lot more to try to get to the Tsar that, hey, we need to speak with you, we want reform, but they also came to the conclusion that the Tsar was willingly enforcing this in Russia, and it was his own fault. And it massively grew up the discontent in Russia due to the Tsar's regime. And many of the cities started breaking out in protests in areas in the Russian Empire. Many of the cities, such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, Novgorod, all these cities, Riga, they all started to really just kind of have massive demonstrations. Protesters were starting to blockade the streets. They were overturning rail lines. They were really just blocking government buildings and just causing chaos. And the Russian police were hesitant to do so. And there was even mutinies in the Navy. There were some battleships that the crew were mutiny against their own commanding officers who were loyal to the Tsar. In other areas of the Russian Empire experienced it, such as in Russian Poland, they had workers that were going on strike, not wanting to work in the factories until something was done. Finland also had a similar condition. And basically, it got to a point where Tsar Nicholas II kind of spoke with his advisors, spoke with his government, and his little inner circle, and it kind of came to the conclusion if he didn't do something or meet to their demands in some degree, they weren't so sure that the Russian people weren't going to finally just kind of take up arms and really just overthrow the monarchy altogether. So Nicholas kind of made a compromise, and in March of 1905, on March 2nd, in fact, he basically allowed for the creation of a Duma, which became the People's Assembly, is what this was. It was a democratic elected legislative assembly for the Russian people that would help govern Russia. Now, although Nicholas had created this, he was very kind of resentful toward it. He had really not wanted to do it at all. The only reason he had really done it because he feared what was going to happen if he didn't meet some of the demands. So he really just did this out of desperation, but not out of want or desire. And this kind of became evident in the couple of years down the road, because even though the Russian people were excited at first that Nicholas had indeed done this, but they became kind of wary over the years because Nicholas repeatedly would suspend the Duma's meetings. When they wouldn't agree with him, he would suspend the meetings of this Duma. They could no longer meet. The Russian people basically had no voice again when this Duma wasn't being said, and it angered the people even more, thinking, well, the Tsar gave us this, and now he's not fulfilling his end of the deal. So what is it going to take to finally get this through his head? And then in October of that year, in response to it, the Russian Empire adopted a new constitution, which became known as the October Manifesto, since it was adopted in October. And this kind of set the remaining way of the Russian imperial government until its fall in 1917, how it would be run, who would be in charge of what could be legally allowed, all that stuff. But at the same time, it did fulfill the people's needs, but also at the same time, it allowed for greater political parties to really kind of form in Russia, which allowed the Bolshevik Party with Vladimir Lenin and his communist revolutionaries such as Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin to really kind of up their revolutionary activity and try to gain influence with the Russian people to support communism, which eventually would succeed in 1917 at the end of it, and lead to the Soviet Union being created shortly thereafter. Basically, the 1905 revolution, although it didn't get rid of the Tsar and his government, and although it didn't exactly collapse the Russian Empire, it still went on for roughly another 12 years. It did weaken the empire to a point, and it did not solve all the problems, and there was still resentment left because of what Nicholas had kind of done at the very beginning and what he continued to do after. He still kind of repressed on the Duma, and then some of the other freedoms that he had given them, eventually he kind of either took back entirely, or he just kind of continued to repress and kind of edge on those freedoms that he had granted them. And the Russian people saw this, and they became very aggravated, and they started to think the 1905 revolution did us nothing. We're going to have to go even harder again to make this clear to the Tsar. We will fight for our rights. We're not just going to sit here and be puppets in your regime. We're sick of being trod on by the autocracies. And it kind of upped revolutionary fervor in Russia, and really it kind of set the stage for the 1917 revolution to take place. All that was really needed was a good spark and failure to really get the Russian people to go to that point, and that would come in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I, which Russia would do very poorly in while it was involved, and would really just turn the Russian people fully against the Tsarist regime to the point that they were willing to abolish it and create a new government. So this kind of, the 1905 revolution kind of in a way helped shape Russia into what it is today by setting the path for the course that it was going to take for the 20th century. In a way, kind of marking toward the end of the imperial regime that Russia had since roughly the 1400s. So, in a way, this event was kind of significant, and I felt was probably something that needed to be addressed, given that it's been 115 years since this really happened. And even today, Russia is still kind of a backward, but also extremely dangerous and powerful nation on this planet. I mean, they can constantly interfere in stuff that there shouldn't be. They're getting involved in conflicts. They're challenging us willy-nilly. They've never really, in my view, they've never really grown out of the Soviet phase. They've changed names, they've changed government form, but they've not grown out of the attitude and persona that the Soviets had. Excuse me. So that's all I had for this little video. I just thought that it was something that needed to be shared. I don't know if I might have not I guess showed or at least spoke much about enough to inform you. I will try to provide some material and links that are good on the Russian 1905 revolution when I get the opportunity here shortly. So that way, if there was something maybe I didn't hit right or maybe I missed, that there will be opportunities that other people have done that you can click on the link and it will bring you to someone that can hopefully understand it or at least explain it just a little more than I could. If I failed to mention something, I do apologize. But that's all I have for this video, and I hope to see you all next time. Until then, good luck and be safe.